Miller Beach Arts and Creative District. We're thrilled to be able to host yet another discussion about this really exciting transportation oriented development and wonderful plans that lots of different organizations and departments of the city and beyond have been talking about for a really long time. We do have some of our original plans over there that Greg Rising and George are looking at, but that kind of fed into some of the conversations that hopefully we'll be having tonight. So thank you all for coming. I hope it's an interactive. I hope you guys want it to be interactive because that's what we do. And I'm sure there's lots of other things that Councilman Wyatt would like to discuss. So I will introduce Councilman Rebecca Wyatt. And thank you all.
Good. Thanks for everybody coming out on such a rainy night. I thought really the rain would keep the crowds away, but then I remembered I'm in the 1st District. So. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Okay. I just want to announce a couple of events that are coming up, and then we'll get right into the redevelopment stuff because that's really the meat of this meeting. And we're going to allow them to do the presentation, and then at the end we'll do questions, okay? You don't have to write them down, but just try to remember them so that you can ask at the end. So the 2 events that I want to tell you about are, one, the Nelson Algren Museum grand opening on March 26th at 3 p.m. And that will be, isn't that great? That is just a wonderful thing. That will be right across the street at the old AT&T building. That's March 26th, 3 p.m., $10. It's something that we all need to support. So thank you very much for that. Now, the really important $7,500 question is, will we make the matching grant for the Gary Preservation Tour? We have 2 workers, Vista workers, that are on loan to the city of Gary, and they've been working on preservation issues. They've organized 2 tours, city tours, and 1 open house, and they've applied for a grant, which they've got for $7,500, but they need to raise another $7,500. And they only have till March 15th to do it. It's at a website called Patronicity, and then it says Gary Preservation, so Patronicity/Gary Preservation. Please go on there and donate something. I clipped out all these little tiny pieces. This is the extent of my arts and crafts that you'll get. But I clipped out all these little pieces that have the website on it where you can donate. It's very important that we do this. I left a couple of brochures back there. What they're going to use the money for is to secure the City Methodist site, for which they got a planning grant to do a ruins garden in the old City Methodist Church site. So that's enormously cool. But they have to secure it so that it doesn't fall on anybody any more than it has. And they're also using it for the day of the event, and also for some flags or banners that they'll be putting down Broadway, some spectacular vertical banners. So it's all for a good cause. Donate whatever you can, but please, the more participation we have, the better. Okay, so that was it. That was it for me. I'm going to have Joe Van Dyke, who is our Director of Redevelopment for the city. He's going to come through first and give us an overview of what we'll be seeing tonight. Thank you. Joe.
All right, thank you. First, I want to thank the Councilwoman for having us out. She's actually my councilperson too, and I'm very happy because she asks a lot of questions and she's really involved, so you're getting well represented here in the 1st District. So this is the Lakefront District Plan. Over the course of many, many years, there's been a lot of planning efforts around this very area, talking about how do we make the most out of being along the train, having the national park, having the beach, how do we improve access and public safety, and really build on the things that make this neighborhood so nice. This has been a long process. It's had a lot of very robust community engagement from all levels of the government and local businesses and state and federal agencies, and Miller Spotlight and the Arts and Creative District and the Miller Citizens Corporation and the other million Miller groups. And this is sort of the culmination of that. We were really lucky because this was a focus area of the mayor and our federal involvement with Strong City, Strong Community. And what that did was allow us to make sure that we reached a lot of constituencies, made sure that everyone's voice got heard. Many ideas were already thought of, many ideas were new to us, and all of it got incorporated in our planning, which you'll see here today. So Jim Vanderkloot from the EPA, who is our Strong City, Strong Community partner, is going to talk about sort of the process that got us here. The Vita Nova team is going to talk about the meats and potatoes of the plan, focusing largely on zoning. So we have a plan for this area. We've established a tax increment financing district to have local funds to go toward many of the infrastructure improvements you'll hear about. And the final piece of that is zoning to make sure we have the regulatory framework. And so after everyone speaks, we'll kind of bring it back home and I'll talk about next steps and how this fits into a larger picture for our whole city. So with that, come on down, Jim.
So hi, Jim Vanderkloot with U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I've spoken to many of you. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of 5 years of federal partnership with the city of Gary, which gives context for this product that you'll be hearing about from our consulting team right afterwards. And
there it is.
there it is.
Since you just want me to push me.
I will do it. Thank you. So there's been a very, very high level of federal assistance in Gary over the last 5 years. This is a very unusual level nationally, and quite a bit has come out of this. And we've been working closely with all the city departments, with a range of local organizations, and we've done a lot of local interviews. And so the products are a product of the collaboration across a range of organizations, the federal government, and the city. This partnership went in 3 phases. First, we came in at the request of the Regional Development Authority, who were having trouble accessing brownfields funds. And so we went through a process with them. We brought in as a consultant the former mayor of Kenosha, John Antaramian, and we walked through the process of how brownfields coalitions have been created elsewhere in the country and how they've been run. The result of which was the RDA and the regional partnership successfully applied for $1.6 million of brownfields grants from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And this money has been utilized in Gary, some of it. The second phase is that after we began working on a regular basis with the city of Gary on brownfields related issues, we saw that there was an opportunity for a very productive partnership using some partnership tools that were in place 4 years ago. And so based upon local knowledge and local intent in terms of what should be done, and also on knowledge of how projects have been successful elsewhere in the country, that's the cities that bring in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investments are the ones that have a clear plan for the future. They have it on a map, they take it out to the representatives and show it to them. And so we worked with Gary and a broad range of partners in working through this during this phase. And we've also worked on some demonstration projects. The third phase, the second phase is positioned Gary to apply for a designation through the Strong City, Strong Communities program, which is a White House program. And this was a very important phase because the plans have been created, but the follow-through, identification of resources for implementation of plans takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and so because Gary successfully applied for that, 3 of us from the federal government were able to spend 2 years in City Hall working with the city in helping to identify and bring in resources. The first main concept, which again, we've been out in this room a number of times to talk about this broader concept, is the creation of a actionable plan. Obviously, in a context of widespread blight and disinvestment, building upon areas of relative economic strength is very important. And as you know, there had been a 2008 proposal, from which I think the first time we arrived in this room, the ground was still shaking from the proposal to shut down the Miller and the downtown station. And so we set out first to find some planning funds, and then we brought in as a consultant Vita Nova, who are here, to help to sort through options. And after listening to a lot of people, and at this stage we conducted about 100 hour-and-a-half interviews. We worked to identify some solutions. The proposal, for those if there is anybody who doesn't know this one, I'm sure this is really core information for you. The proposal was to create a giant park and ride, so people from outside of town could drive in and park, and they were going to shut down both of the main train stations. And so we set out to create a win-win solution. And the way this process worked is that we met every other week with mayor and key staff. The mayor, at the end of a series of discussions, designated a district, the Gary Northside Redevelopment Project, which stretches from Horace Mann through Emerson Downtown, through Miller, Etna, and Glen Ryan. And as plans were created then, we invited in as many federal partners as we could think of, and state agencies and foundations, and we presented it to them all to see what funding streams there were that could potentially help to implement these things. So as the plans were actually finalized, they were finalized around a practical knowledge of what money was out there for implementation purposes. And so this is when we say actionable plans, that's what this means. This positioned the city to successfully get money for planning in 3 different districts from EPA, HUD, and DOT. The 3 districts obviously were sitting in one, the Lakefront District, Miller, Etna, and Glen Ryan. And the story later in this presentation will focus on that entirely. But a total of $860,000 in planning funds have come into Gary, the University Park, and through the Gary Northside Redevelopment Project, through 3 different sources. There's a plan also, Creating Livable Centers plan, that covers Emerson Downtown and Horace Mann. Focusing in now on the Lakefront District, you'll hear a much more detailed description of this, but the key concept that helped to lead towards a win-win solution here is that South Shore Line said they needed a length of straight track in order to put in a raised platform and station to shorten commute times, and that's why they couldn't have it here. And the concept that came out of, again, many discussions was that using the right-of-way of Route 12 and rerouting Route 12 so that it joins up with Route 20 over here rather than way over there would leave space for the straight track. And this was a game changer, right? This was presented to the Congressman's office and to NICD and to the RDA, and everybody bought into this. The next phase, this is an older version of the design, but we were able to get more money for planning from US EPA for this district. Again, there were a broader series of interviews with a lot of community leaders, and a proposal was put together. And the core of this is that transit-oriented development in this area could serve Miller, Etna, and Glen Ryan equally. And it was designed very specifically around that concept. This has been successful in lining up implementation funds. We made a sadly unsuccessful attempt to apply for a Tiger grant, but when that didn't fly, the other funds were identified. So there is a brownfields area-wide assessment for 640 properties through this quarter that's been completed. There is a tax increment finance district is underway by the city. The engineering for the rail improvements and the NEPA work, which is necessary to do that, that's underway to the tune of $4 million from the Regional Development Authority. The rerouting of Route 12 and the Green Complete Streets work, this is funded through NDOT and through the RDA to the tune of $6.7 million. And last of all, the subject of our presentation today, is zoning code and ordinance updates, which are necessary in order to do redevelopment. The zoning codes and ordinances have to change in order to accommodate redevelopment. And so we were able to use US EPA dollars to support that as well. Very quickly, there's been a lot of other things going on during this time with federal partnership with the city, with a range of organizations, and coordinating public sector investments is the second main strategy. Green infrastructure throughout the city. Just for quick background, there was an initial EPA-funded project by the RDA which set the stage for further work. At this stage, we sat down with the city and ran through a broad range of potential funding sources for green infrastructure. And which one could be matched for the other, which one would complement the third, which one would build upon the next. And the city successfully applied. Something happened to my slide. The city, that's sad. There were a whole series of these, many of which are not showing on my slide right now. The city successfully applied for a whole series of green infrastructure grants, adding up to a total of $2.3 million worth of funds, which have been used for a range of purposes which are visible on the ground at this point. Sorry about that. One use of this funding is combining residential demolition and green infrastructure. The city successfully applied for $6.6 million in housing demolition funds. These funds originate from the U.S. Department of Treasury. And this was incorporated, combined with some funding that came through in green infrastructure funds. And so there have been some beautiful examples, one right here in Etna. I hope that you have driven by this location. Oh, is that better? You can't hear me otherwise?
No, it's for the video.
For the video, I was thinking I'm loud. Okay, quickly, this site brings together all the different types of work. This is a site at 12th and Oklahoma. Here it is before Joe tore it down, and it was a burned out home. It was torn down through hardest hit funds, and then it was redeveloped as green infrastructure through the Vacant Vibrant program of the Cleveland Botanic Gardens, and very beautiful project. Here's how it turned out. Another example project which used green infrastructure dollars and dollars from a range of sources was the Sheraton Hotel demolition. Funding from EPA and funding from HUD were utilized this, as well as funding from the Regional Development Authority. And the building came down. We were working in City Hall during this. It was great fun, I think, for us to hear the banging outside. And this is what it looked like after the demolition. It was reseeded. Danielle is here, who helped to lead a charrette on reuse of the property. A lot of people came in to express their opinions about how it should be reused, and green infrastructure funds, which were accessed through the process I described earlier, are being used right now and to redevelop the northern portion of the site and the parking lot. As green infrastructure, water will soak into the ground rather than going into the sewers. Quite a bit of demolition money has flowed due to this partnership. This is not, the federal government didn't come in and make this all happen. This happened by a lot of people working together, right? And so it is all added up. Last of all, I just want to point out we've had a number of federal agencies out. On the top left, we had 50 people out from the Department of Transportation to look at hazards for bikes and pedestrians at one point. They made a report on that. On the top right, we have the Army Corps of Engineers talking about wetlands. On the bottom right, we have the U.S. Geological Survey looking at where the water from the roof of City Hall goes when it goes into the drain, apparently into the wall mostly. I'm going to run through the rest of this very quickly because I'm out of time. You are blessed with a wonderful foundation here. Legacy Foundation has been a spectacular partner to work with for us, and the collaboration with Legacy Foundation has branched off in a number of directions. One is Neighborhood Spotlight Program, that nonprofit capacity building and creation of a broader scope is very important to the future of this community. And 2 grants have been funded, 2 neighborhood spotlight groups have been funded within the Gary Northside Redevelopment Project, leading to those groups coming up with their own projects and getting them funded independently. So it's something that continues on. It's a thing of beauty. The second, Gary Northside planning, part of that was designed so that context would be created for investment from larger foundations. Larger foundations needed to see that they could invest in projects in Gary and have it be done within a context of development, context of hope for the future. This helped the Bloomberg Trust and the Knight Foundation to invest in Gary. The last 2 rounds of Knight City Challenge, Gary has received the largest chunk of funds from the Knight Foundation. And last of all, Legacy Foundation joined with the city in applying for a Choice Neighborhood Planning Grant for the University Park neighborhood. Only 7 of these were awarded in the country. These are very hard to get, and it was because the city and Legacy worked together. Last of all, I'm going to breeze through these. There's been a series of technical assistance programs, local foods, local places, by EPA and USDA, crime and data work through the Department of Justice, workforce development support through the Department of Labor, the Small Business Administration, GSA, et cetera. And the city's Gary for Jobs program, which was funded privately, has gotten support through the Axion, which is funded through the Economic Development Administration. The Federal Reserve helped convene lenders to support this program. The Small Business Administration has been involved in bringing in support through the Small Business Development Center. I'm listing all these because a lot of work went into bringing all these different federal agencies to the table. These are relationships that are formed, and many of which will continue. So this is the context. I have a little animated slide here, but it's an old guy animated slide. It's not really elegant. Planning resources are key. A lot of the point of this is that having that plan in place leads to investment. And I really feel that this has been borne out over the last 4 years. Green infrastructure funding, $2.3 million. Large building demolition. Housing demolition, $11.5 million at this point, and counting, Joe. Foundation investments, almost $3 million. Engineering and construction, including $3 million from EDA for a road elsewhere. Other technical assistance was $444,000, totaling $34.5 million. So we're bringing us then back down to the ground level of today. What we're going to talk about is the final product from the EPA technical assistance through Vita Nova for the Lakefront District, which is the zoning codes and ordinances. And that was the background. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rosalind Mitchell of Forms and Function Architects and former Director of Planning for the City of Gary. I've been fortunate enough to be a part of the Vita Nova team, and I would like to introduce our team members for you this evening. We have Christopher Steenon, who is an architect and planner. We also have Danielle Costanini, who's a project manager. Of course, the leader of Vita Nova, Mike Taylor, as well as Dave Corris, who is also a planner from Vita Nova. So without much further ado, I'm going to ask Christopher to come up and start our presentation. We want to thank you all for coming out this evening.
Thanks. Can you pick me up if we put this down, or would you prefer we hold it? It's only for the recorder. Oh. I'll talk loud, I promise. So Chris and I are gonna go back and forth throughout this slideshow that really details this last phase of work that was just described. And I think I'm going to start mostly with a broader overview of the plan, and Chris is going to go into greater detail on the actual zoning, the code that will govern private investment in this area. I'm going to reiterate a lot of the themes that you've heard because I think they're particularly important and really owe you all a lot of credit. This is a phenomenal crowd. This is a great turnout, and I think it's a testament to the fact that you've all been engaged and involved thus far, and you will continue to be so because that's crucially important for the future implementation. Really what we're talking about here is the revitalization of underperforming assets that you as a community own, right? These are properties within your community that aren't doing all that they can for the betterment of your neighborhood and for the realization of your vision. And so what I think we're going to describe that many of you have seen before, but you'll see kind of distilled here, is that vision for the area around Miller Station that's designed to leverage these federal and state investments and regional investments to take advantage of them for greater local benefit. A lot of what you'll see is about increasing development on underutilized or underdeveloped properties with new housing and new commercial development. That new housing leads to more people in the community. More people will be shopping in local stores on Lake Street and throughout the community. They'll be starting up their own businesses. More shopping and more businesses will result in additional jobs for the community. And all of that results in more tax revenue and building permit fees and other revenue sources that reduce the burden on single-family homeowners and allow for increasing services to be delivered by the city to your community. A lot of this, as has been described, really builds off the impetus of the train station. I think you all deserve a ton of credit already, having been involved in this partnership that's resulted in not only the retainage of the station, but the reinvestment therein, right? This is a phenomenal success story already, being able to further investment in what can be the anchor in the community for private investment and additional jobs, housing, and revenue. The rest of what you'll see is really building off of that and trying to take advantage of, first and foremost, the land within walking distance and closest proximity to the station, where you could take advantage of commuting traffic, but also the half-mile radius where you're most likely to see economic impact of transit investment, and then further down on Route 20 and in the surrounding neighborhoods, trying to leverage that further deeper into the community. What you'll see is a series of kind of sub-districts within this larger district that are designed to tailor private investment within individual areas. The purpose of the guidelines are really to steer that private investment. When we talk about planning, planning is great, planning is a vision, planning sets down the agenda that we have for our community and has been described. Planning can give certainty to your partners, and that will develop a track record and want to spur investment, but really planning doesn't implement, right? Implementation takes place through two functions. Expenditures by the public sector through capital improvements, and you've already done, again, a phenomenal job through the station plan, the rail realignment plan, the Route 12-20 intersection plan, and through investments by the private sector. And it's zoning, it's the regulatory framework, the development code that governs how that private investment furthers your community vision. And you'll see three aspects of the code that will go into greater detail: development, the actual buildings, landscape, the vegetation and the streetscape character, and then signage. The core areas, as I mentioned, I'm sorry this is a little bit faded, but you can see the core district, again, within that closest proximity to the station area, and the secondary districts radiating out from that along Route 20 and into the surrounding neighborhoods. The vision, which Christopher will go into greater detail in the code, is intensifying at the core of the station area, which will include and really require public-private partnerships in most instances to achieve the development potential that will be, in keeping with neighborhood character, but maximizing the potential of the properties in closest proximity to the station, and then that scales down as you approach the neighborhoods, reducing density from that core. It's reliant on a series of public improvements that include larger regional scale public improvements like the 1220 realignment, like the railroad realignment, but also series of secondary public improvements to enhance both the automobile street grid and the traffic flow, but also pedestrian flow and transportation alternatives. As has been mentioned many times, we've already seen the largest foundational investments receive a significant amount of funding and begin to get underway through the realignment of 12, freeing up developable land and unlocking the rail realignment potential. Chris, I'll invite you to talk a bit about the cross sections.
So we started to focus on Route 20, which was really the main spine that connected almost all of these districts. And as we've described earlier, that we wanted to create something that's going from the outsides into the middle. And the train station is clearly the center, the focus of the whole area. So the zoning begins to look at putting greater densities at the train station and less on the outside. And initially we came up with some concepts for Route 20 which reflected that idea, going from an idea that's maybe more green and more with less buildings on it toward a middle where there is a more urban context. So on the outer ends of it we were looking at types of development that might have more surface parking and fewer buildings as opposed to the middle, which is just the opposite. So we sort of showed different concepts about and different examples about what that might look like. And this sort of established an initial idea we had, as I said, that looks to focus the intensity of the development really in the middle, and then sets up guidelines, which I'll get into in a moment, for how development will be looking further out. And so, as I mentioned, we had this initial vision, the sort of the stage one, if you want to call it, look at all of this, looking at Route 20, the realignments of the rail and the infrastructure and investments, and ultimately the introductions of new zoning and guidelines to steer the development in a direction which begins to reinforce this nature of Route 20 as we sort of described it. And then ultimately there is sort of, I don't want to call it sort of a phase two or a later phase that then begins to capitalize on this new community center, really, the focus on the train station by improving connections from the south, from Etna, to get to the Route 20 corridor. And in fact, there's already been the beginnings of some investments which have been put in place. I think there was some discussion earlier about different crossing points that will help facilitate pedestrian movement across Route 20, and that's actually being undertaken already, and that's just almost the initial stages of where these things could go. And then also from the north, from Miller and Glen Ryan, you know, that there's opportunities perhaps to find ways to the train station other than walking from the very far extremities of Lake and Clay Street. So there might be the potential, so we sort of wanted to introduce those ideas. And ideally what this is trying to create, particularly at the train station, is a really truly pedestrian-oriented neighborhood or character, so that there's public spaces, there's commercial activities that help activate those spaces, there's not the gross interference between automobile traffic and people boarding and loading up on trains. So that was the idea that began to steer this. And once we had the vision in mind, we were trying to figure out how the zoning would then be recalibrated to help facilitate that. The existing zoning, we looked at it, it's quite a quilt work of different patterns on here. We're focusing, of course, in the area that's mostly red. What we realized when we first looked at the zoning was that as it is today, it actually promotes lower density at the train station than you find out at the highway. So it was almost the reverse of what we thought it should be. And so we looked at it again and then established this district, which we've looked at, this sort of more focused center here where we put a lot of the attention, the idea being that we would reverse that, quite simply. The higher density would be at the train station in the middle, where you would have pedestrian movements and so forth, and then lower densities out at the fringes and edges of this district. And this led us to look at conceiving of this as a series of different zones along Route 20. We came up with names also from gateways, the Transit-Oriented Development Center, which is the TOD initials on this, transition areas, which are sort of, we just refer to it as being in between, really, the less dense and the more central urban areas. And of course, there's a light industrial area just to the eastern side of Lake Street, which is already there. So we're playing with the types of things that are already there and trying to nudge development in a direction to help create this type of pedestrian area at the train station. And so that led us to identify several new zoning districts. And I'll go through these just to describe what they are. Again, we were trying to figure out how to take the big concepts we had and then really codify it, so to speak, so that it could be translated into guidelines that a property developer would be able to look at and understand in order to offer some predictability which could be going on the property, and also at the same time nudge new development in the direction that we were hoping to see along in the area. Now, of course, with any zoning code, you already have a lot of existing things that are out there, and so it's not like you turn the switch and all of a sudden things are going to change. It's a long process, starting with new development on vacant properties or on land that can be acquired to sort of follow as much as the market can bear to allow new development in areas, approaching the character that we're hoping it to have. And over time, as redevelopment happens, you end up with something that begins to approach what we were imagining. And of course, like I said, this is, there's nuances to this. There are times where properties will remain and or something doesn't change, or that they do evolve into something. So we've set up the framework to make things happen through this guidelines code. And it allows a bit of flexibility on what that might look with, but in general, it's trying to aim for particular characteristics in these areas. That was clear. So in the middle, what we refer to as the TOD, the Transit-Oriented Development Station District, which is really right at the train station. We were following a lot of ideas that have been brought out in the public meetings and the discussions with you about what these characteristics would be. Almost across the board, I remember there was a whole lot about make it more walkable, make it more pedestrian, create the kind of public space that we're looking at. I mean, I feel like that was sort of mentioned for almost all of these areas, and so this is where we started to go with all these. The idea was that the intersection of Lake Street and Route 20 could be seen as being more urban, really marking that area instead of the opposite, which you feel like you have today. That was the idea. We found some precedents. We were saying, we're thinking of ideas where just buildings are closer to the street. That's something that we would like, as opposed to where the buildings are far away and the parking is at the street. We wanted to reverse that pattern. And I have, some of the guideline diagrams that we set up, which just specifically talk to, the level of development floor area that's permitted in the particular areas, where it would go, how big it could be, the types of uses that could go in there. We sort of have looked at all of these things, and quite simply, when we look at the development right around the train station, we have, set up guidelines that try to encourage or mandate really active uses on the ground floor along public spaces, the idea of public place around the train station, accessibility issues, the careful placement of garage entrances, things like this, so that we could try to create the type of environment that we'd hope to. And then around the train station itself, we'd had ideas about specifically the landscaping and the characteristics that could acquire right up again and next to the building.
I would just add, zoning is always a balancing act, right? You're always trying to control for the things that you care about in a community, while recognizing that you don't want to be overly burdensome or overly restrictive on private development, and leave a certain amount of flexibility to respond to market changes or building construction costs, etc. And so zoning is really an art where you're trying to identify what are the things we care about most. What are the things that, if they were to be compromised, they would undermine the larger vision, and make sure that we control for those, and not try and nitpick and control every little detail of the overall development. And so, what Christopher's describing is a code that really tries to control for those key elements, the relationship between the building and the sidewalk, or the private and the public realm, the relationship between parking and the pedestrian streetscape, the relationship between loading docks, making sure that the car infrastructure and the logistic infrastructure is all accommodated, but doesn't dominate the landscape and compromise the pedestrian experience. But you don't want to be overly prescriptive, and so we leave a fair amount of flexibility for the development community to do what they do best, which is understand changing market conditions and deliver a product that will work.
Exactly. In order to achieve, the vision we had like this, active public spaces, in as much as possible, sidewalks that connect to the communities and the neighborhoods around, a Route 20 that is not so difficult to cross that it forms a barrier, all sorts of things. So that's really where we've been going with these things. Moving outside of the center, we start to see more of a transition going on. So that's where we're allowing a little bit more flexibility. This is the existing development that you have out there, and so there's more greenery. Buildings might be pulled back a little bit further from the street. It might be more intermittent, so that sometimes there's parking lots and sometimes there's buildings, but done in a controlled manner so that the public realm, the right-of-ways, the public walking areas are very carefully controlled. And so in this case, we're allowing, as David mentioned, a great deal more flexibility as we move away from the center so that buildings can move a little bit further around on the site. There's the possibility for, we've set a maximum level of density, of development density that could go there, but we understand that in some cases there might be less than what's allowable. So all of that can work. And like I said, and as David mentioned, we've set up a couple of rules so that when those are followed, ideally when it all adds up together, you have a much better environment. Similarly, for the industrial areas, we were looking for controls that went from something that was looking like what you have now, and again, with landscaping and through the ideas of pedestrian, to create something that was more in keeping with this. And really, these are sort of simple moves. It's not that the building is any different than what it was, it's just that we're putting it on a different part of the site, and we're thinking about what the parking lots will be like, or can you put landscaping along Route 20 to help mask some of the more industrial features that you don't want to see, and at the same time create a positive pedestrian experience along Route 20. And then at the ends, really the extreme outside portions of the study area, we refer to it as the gateway area. And what we realized, certainly when you're coming from the west, you're encountering the backs of properties as opposed to the fronts of properties. It's not all the time, but quite a bit so. And so what we really focused on was landscaping along these areas. And we wanted landscaping in a fashion that was more natural, more forested in a way, to create, like we said, a sort of a gateway as you progress along the road to a more urban environment as you get to the middle. And consecutively, as you go out the other side or come from the other side, we do the same thing. So we looked at areas where there might be open space or greenery, street trees, and reimagining what Route 20 might be, and really focusing on what the edges might be as sort of a wooded edge on this area, so that the pedestrian zones within the setback and distance from the roadway is, again, a rather pleasant area where you can walk or bike. And then also off of Route 20, we looked at these commercial corridors, these sort of smaller scale pedestrian corridors. And initially when we looked at them, we said, well, these are doing exactly what we want. We actually like what we're seeing outside and the way that the areas work. We saw that there was room for improvement. And this has evolved over time with the codes that you have in place now. But what we wanted to do was to make sure that in the future there wasn't moves that damaged what you have already. For example, a developer buying up several properties and putting in a retailer with a big parking lot would very much change the character of Lake Street and the area. And so what we wanted to do was to sort of limit what could be done that way. And so in a sense, we wrote guidelines to mimic what's going on already with sort of small scale retail frontages. There's the potential, we thought, to put residential above, which is always beneficial to any kind of commercial area. And we also thought that there was room for improvements to the street right-of-way itself in terms of additional street trees and maybe wider sidewalks and things to help make this, again, a more enjoyable pedestrian environment. The district that we actually defined in this, and we had talked a little bit about this with the city planning, but this is sort of turned on its side, but Lake Street is sort of running along the bottom there, heading off to the lake, off to the left, and then Miller Street. And so actually we took both of those streets and kind of combined them into this type of district, thinking that as Lake Street advances or as it begins to fill out, that there's sort of an outlet for more of the same to begin to progress down other parts of it. Because you do have commercial zoning along both streets, and so we said, okay, well, if we're going to do commercial development here in the future, this is sort of how it would look. And so, again, we looked at where that might go. We looked at the individual types of properties that you had there and really said, okay, well, that's great. We can do more of these things. So we want to bring the buildings again to the sidewalk where they're going to animate that activity. There's the potential for residential above, and there's, advantages to doing that, of course. And as I mentioned, with the street right-of-way, we looked at perhaps the idea of including more streets where there are parked cars, maybe reducing the number of moving lanes in some places, but generally trying to green up the area and improve the pedestrian zone, and at the same time maintain the type of development that we see happening along either side. So we looked at different things. What I just sort of went through was all sorts of guidelines dealing with the size of the building, where the building gets located, where you put parking and things like that, how all that worked, just as David had described. We also looked at landscape guidelines because we realized that was quite important. And there's a distinction here because you have existing street rights-of-way where there will be hopefully new landscaping ideas and street improvements, and then you have the private development. And predominantly along Route 20, we had built-in setbacks for pedestrian areas, and there's zones where the buildings might be set back a little further, or where there might be parking areas. We said we need to come up with a landscaping which will be compatible with the types of things we're hoping will happen along Route 20 and along Lake Street. And so we set up guidelines to try to create a larger harmonious idea about how that might be done. So looking along Route 20, for example, in this sort of transition zone, for example, we have the idea of what might happen along Route 20, showing street trees and new vegetations and things. We don't know what will be with Route 20. It'll obviously go through a whole process with INDOT as they decide how that works and what all the rules will be. But we do know, and we've emphasized over and over in the code, that because you're so close to this national park and the dune systems, that we want to emphasize the importance of local vegetation, of native species. We don't want to have all sorts of different things in here, so we're really emphasizing that. We came up with a plant palette that will focus on what types you can use and then how they could be done. So for example, in areas where there might be parked cars, we talked about how you might step the vegetation and create understory plantings and things like this to help create a buffer between where the pedestrians are and where the parked cars are. Yes?
I'm sorry, I don't remember right. I just got the names. They've been to the city on 20 as I read like this week. It is. I mean, it is. It's established by ordinance and it's the red light district. And so in your planning, how do you plan to deal with that? Because that is the gateway.
That's a land use question, and we have addressed it, and I'm going to answer that question right when I get to the end, because I'm actually right on the other topic of landscaping, but hold to that thought, because we did do that, because when we looked at all the zoning, we've looked at the uses, and we've set up which are uses that are permitted in different districts and those which would require special permits, and quite frankly, there were uses that we just wanted to go away. And so I think that sort of is in line with what you've been talking about, and I'll address that in more detail in just a moment, but let me just finish through these last few slides and then we'll get to the questions. So just to emphasize again, idea of native species that we really wanted to see we've looked at different examples in different areas where we thought just sort of to illustrate what the character might be. We've put these into our guidelines. We've established plant palettes, and again, looking at areas where you might have more regulated vegetation, trees in rows and more manicured ideas of how the understories might be done, and it would slowly transition out to something that's more forested or more natural. And I think we looked at parking areas, how those might be done. We really like the ideas of green infrastructure and parking lots. Parking lots are one of the greatest sources of all sorts of stormwater runoff, and so that's a place where if you plant trees or create medians which can collect water, you can make a huge difference. We've talked about the use of permeable surface material in portions of parking areas. We've set up all sorts of ideas about this, again, sort of as recommendations of how we want to see those done. And then again, in the light industrial areas, the same sorts of things. These have much broader setbacks than what you have in the middle, so there's room to do much more. There's room to do quite a bit of green infrastructure across those areas between the right-of-way of Route 20 and the private development. And finally, with the Gateway District being much more natural in character, but again, focusing on native species to do that. And so that's been set up. We've got all these little code ideas. We've listed the plant types, which districts we think they're appropriate in, how they might be used. We've got all sorts of images of things of what we think are appropriate, and so forth. And then the last part of our of the code that we looked at was with signage. And you do have signage ordinances in place. We were sort of trying to respond to what we were seeing along Route 20, which just seemed to be a whole cacophony of different kinds of signs. And so we've looked at signs on buildings, we've looked at freestanding signs, we've looked at signs on smaller streets or street awnings and things like this, and in windows and how that might be done. This meshes very well with some of the things that you already have, but it's being sort of reinforced and pointed towards having, you know, minimal signage on buildings. We don't want super graphics dominating. We're trying to avoid flashing lighted signs in different places. And so, and just sort of a mix-up of the different things that might be going on there.
Yeah, and again, just trying to be responsive to that balance. Not going as far as, you know, prescribing font type or material or color. But we want to leave it to private businesses to advertise their store the way they see most fit, but ensure that there's consistency and that there's quality and that everything in the district has a certain character and a certain quality so that everything is contributing to the larger vision and larger strategy, and no one sign can be egregious and undermine the overall.
Okay, I said red light district, that was not signs.
No, we know that. I know there's a certain type of sign that might be associated with that, but we were trying to deal with something different. Yeah. So I know, and 2 more slides, and I'll invite Joe up to answer that. So again, with freestanding signs, similar things. We were looking for signage that was in keeping or in character with the types of buildings that they're associated with, not sort of a mismatch or a mixture of different things. We really want signs that are lit with lights as opposed to being light sources themselves, or sort of the backlit signs, which is why some of these things have the X drawn through them, less because of the fonts or the style. And in fact, we even mentioned the lower right-hand corner actually isn't a bad sign. It's just that it's backlit. We really wanted things that were lit from the front. So there was that, and then finally, we did look at temporary signage in windows and how that might be addressed in terms of, we don't want to plaster all of the windows with bold graphic signage. We're trying to, limit that to a smaller percentage of the glass in those areas. And in fact, that I think meshes very well with some of the current zoning that we have. So,
and if you're having a grand opening or a sale, we want you to be able to temporarily advertise that, but your grand opening doesn't last for years and years. Yeah. The sale can't go on for 4 months. We want there to be, some limitations in place, so that we have, again, that kind of high quality.
So, Joe, do you want to address that question?
Yeah, sure. I guess we'll just do the questions in general.
Well, the first one that's up is about the red light district.
So that is, obviously, how that is done now.
Joe, we need for you to come over here.
You got to get in front of the camera.
The video. And I just want to say, thank you all very much for holding your questions. And let's just notice there was a retired school teacher who did not hold her questions. But I'm not saying. All right. So, and Joe, just stand around here because that's how the video can get.
Sure. So anyway, that is something that's being addressed. Our code is very old and antiquated in many respects. This is one of them. So right now, I can tell you that the law department is looking over our global sexually oriented business statute to make sure that we don't have any issues with free speech, but we can dictate where those things can go and not along our most visible corridors. Our former councilwoman, Ms. Cruces, went after their liquor licenses, and a lot of you were there when the former Pandoras tried to do that same thing. They were closed down. They ended up going through the process, and the BZA is currently considering that as well, and it was overwhelmingly not a good idea from the residents. So we're working on it. It's very old code. It's being improved. And when we think about uses and where things go, we're going to have to redistribute where are those type of uses, and certainly along our corridors is not an option. Yes, Mr. Nowacki.
Yes, it was Jim Nowacki. I live in the 2nd District, and I watched very carefully through the entire presentation. I looked at all of your exhibits. I listened very carefully to every word you used, and one word that was not used, one picture that was not posted, and there's no language whatsoever regarding buses. Now, if you're talking about a transportation-oriented development, and we've got the finest bus system in the entire 6-county region, and to have no mention of it, I just want to ask, was that deliberate that you didn't address that, or was it accidental, or is there some way that we can, out of the hundreds of millions of dollars we're spending here, make some small accommodation for all of the, first of all, our wonderful bus system, but also our wonderful bus riders, such as myself, who also use the South Shore. But could you just give us some idea why you haven't had even one tiny little bit of your plan that would be the buses?
Okay, everyone's so excited to answer that. It's a great question, Mr. Nowacki.
I always have good questions.
Well,
That's why I come to these meetings.
Well, I'm so happy you do. We have Mr. Wright from GPTC right over there. We've talked with him. We've worked with Nicky, who's still figuring out the alignment and the final placement of the station, and it will be multimodal. And that is, we didn't mention explicitly bikes either, but bikes are part of the plan. Pedestrians, accessibility for the elderly and children and people with disabilities, all of that are critical components. And I would let David mention anything else, but we've spoken at length about a lot of these things.
Real quickly, my name is David Wright. I'm the Planning and Marketing Manager for Gary Public Transportation Corporation. Coincidentally, about a week and a half ago, we had a meeting with the Northern Indiana Commuter Transportation District, specifically talking about station area development around the Lake Street Station. And one of their goals is to make sure that wherever they site their final station, they want to make sure it's accessible to our buses. So at the municipal level and at the transportation district level, there has been a lot of cooperation and planning to make sure this is as multimodal a facility as possible.
But it's not in any of the plans.
Well, it's going to be
This is, I would just clarify to say that this is not the transportation plan. This is the zoning strategy for how private development will take advantage of the transportation improvements being provided by multiple levels of government. So the more transit there is, the better train service, the more bus routes, the more bike lanes, the better pedestrian connections, the more value there is that private development can take advantage of. And this plan is about the regulatory tools to ensure that when that private investment takes place, it's realizing your vision and not undermining it. But this plan is not about what bus routes and exactly what transportation improvements will be deployed to create that value. That we rely on our great partners at the transit district and the state and the county and regional.
Exactly. The plan works with buses. It does.
Yes.
Okay, Eric?
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, so, my name's Eric Reed, and I wanted to congratulate this community. This has been a long time coming. There was a time period when we went through where they were going to take the train station. Many of us in this neighborhood, through the MCC, we had a big meeting at the church in the corner. And in one of the final meetings that we had with the South Shore
the director at the time, Gerald Haynes, told George, myself, Greg Jenkins, that their customers from the south did not want to have or come to an urban station. I about levitated off my seat. Pat Lee was sitting next to me, and Greg looked at me and turned red as he is now. But this is a long time coming, so you should congratulate yourselves at the tenacity of this community, because from that point where we were going to have no station to this point, to driving around Gary with Jim Vanderploot the first time, to every single community, and he decided to come back to Miller, and I excused myself because I always got accused of loving Miller. I said, yeah, because I grew up there for 50 years. But we're at this place, everybody can always be naysayers and say what's not or what isn't, but this is such a long time coming, and congratulations to yourselves for getting this far. So Jim, there's buses there, you can say what you want, you should really just pay your property taxes, and so it can be better. But congratulations, and thank you to all who worked very hard in this very room to get here. Greg Jenkins put in a lot of money and time to do the base plans for this. And I mean, tens of thousands of dollars that people put forth to get to this point. So congratulations to yourself.
Yeah, what I'm not seeing, or I'm not getting is, when we fought initially with everybody and Nick and.
You're gonna have to come up if it's gonna be long. I was gonna
No,
repeat it, but if you
all
gotta.
I'm asking is, I don't see the proximity of the actual walking distance, if you will, from where the trains people would depart.
Okay, so the question
Through
is,
Lake Street, where the business district is, which, I mean, they get off the train now, they see Lake Street, they walk down the street, go to like those businesses. I mean, it's.
and the question is,
Where's the train
How far
Where-
is.
where the station-
I'm not getting
Okay.
the actual distance.
okay, the question is, she's not getting the actual distance between the train station and where
It'd be the
people will
same
be walking.
proximity.
Yeah, I mean,
It's the
Roughly
same
the same
proximity.
location.
It's the same proximity. The new
From
station,
where our.
current
depot
station is
now.
now. Same proximity as where it is now.
Okay,
And-
that I couldn't see.
Those are not actual plans, they're overviews, so you can't,
Right, no, I
you can't,
get
look at it for specificity.
I'm not, but I just still, I could read it.
don't see it.
Drawing on here?
Okay, we got another question. We gotta keep moving with questions, because we're at 27.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Could you, Jim, maybe say, when we pass rezone,
Sure.
whoever
I didn't
can
know.
answer
Okay.
this, how are existing establishments grandfathered in, or do they have a timeline in which they have to make changes to meet new code?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Could you repeat the question?
The
so
question is,
that
there are
it-
existing businesses grandfathered in, or is there a time when they have to meet the code? Largely it depends, so the answer is yes, they're grandfathered in. And depending on the extent to which alterations are made to the building, that would dictate if you need to make changes as well. So some things like, say you redo your parking lot, we would want you to follow the landscaping guidelines. That's a basic thing that's less expensive, but makes a real impact on the way it looks, right? However, if you're fixing your windows or your doors, or you're adding on a little bit to the back, it probably would be okay, depending again on the extent to which you change it. And I guess if you want to get into technical weeds.
Yeah, I mean, zoning governs new investment. So it doesn't force you to make any changes to your existing property. And it allows you to make basic maintenance and even some enhancement investments without having to come into conformance with the new zoning. What it doesn't allow you to do is significantly
that one of the guidelines is ADA, one of the ADA guidelines. But to what extent, especially as we grandfather businesses and so on, to ensure that the monitoring and the enforcement of ADA guidelines are followed. Just recently heard that a lot of construction that we have that has been done, but they still fail to follow ADA guidelines. So that's a major concern for many of us, especially when we want to age in place.
So the question was, how do you ensure
Those
that?
ensure enforcement.
ADA yeah, so
ADA
enforcement.
guidelines. Besides, more than the ADA guidelines, we really follow a universal design on all aspects.
Absolutely. So there's sort of two ways people develop property. They do it the right way, and they go through the building department, our building commissioners here, and they go through the zoning department to make sure they're meeting their guidelines, and there are people who just do it, right? So for the latter, it's largely a matter of code enforcement. It's largely a matter of stopping people's permits, stop work orders, and that sort of thing. What I can commit is that all of the public investments will be ADA compliant, and that is probably the first thing on the list. When we look at our investments, first thing on our priority list are sidewalks, big sidewalks, along 20, where there aren't any. You see people walking along the side of the highway trying to get to the grocery store from their homes. So that's the very first thing. And our investments, the public investments, right? So we're going to steer what we can do to match the priorities of the neighborhood and match what the community vision is, at the same time regulating what private people do to do that. And assuming everyone's following the rules, it will be ADA compliant. To the extent it's not, that's a matter of code enforcement and pulling
So
permits.
Can we ensure that as of now, because I see Shelby, how can we depend
Yes.
count on the future?
Yes.
When right now on Shelby and right in front of the restaurants and so on are not being enforced.
That's a damn good
Major
point.
violation.
Yep.
Two questions. Is this presentation available online because it's very difficult to see?
Sure.
Because I was standing in the way.
We can make it available online, yes.
I think it is. We have websites.
And there's a website of
lakefrontdistrict.com.
Yeah.
lakefrontdistrict.com. And we'll also post it on the city site as well.
Okay, and the second question is, with a
Oh,
new
that's not it. That's not it.
any of the funding that has not that has already come, but extending into the future, is it in jeopardy?
I don't know how to answer that. The question was, is future funding in jeopardy? I don't think anyone in this room could answer that question. I would guess people in the White House probably couldn't answer that question right now either. But I will say there's been a significant amount of investment that's already been committed to it. That's not going anywhere. And we've also set up steps to find our own investment, private investment through the state that's not incumbent upon the federal government.
Max Gresham. There seem to be some really massive zoning changes going on in this plan. The southeast corner, for example, of Lake Street, Route 20, which is commercial, at least from what I can see, is going to change to multifamily housing. Also along the south side of Route 20, and I understand this is facing designated truck route has been changed to the medium density housing. And the other, Miller Avenue, which is currently zoned commercial, it has only 2 businesses on it, has been maintained as commercial. I wonder if you just give a little discussion or thought going into where you're putting what and what.
Route 20 is commercial with an allowance for residential. If you want to do it, we're trying to promote mixed use. If you build the mixed use, you get to do the maximum amount of development on the property. If you just do one, you get a part of it.
If I could just interject, we're not trying to promote mixed use, we're trying to allow mixed use.
Yeah, thank you.
Again, this is one issue that we've had citywide, and why this is applicable to a larger planning effort, building on our existing comp plan, doing neighborhood planning, is we have really rigid, old ordinances that make it really difficult to develop here, and make it, as a homeowner, difficult to make changes to your home. So what we're trying to do is make sure we have a dynamic set of ordinances and zoning codes that allow for a range of things while controlling for those externalities that neighbors don't want.
One of the biggest challenges that we face in our communities with the difficulty in updating these types of regulations is they are rigid, as Joe described, and they don't allow for resilience. When markets change, when consumer preferences change, when the economy changes, they can't respond. And so what this doesn't by any means try and guess what comes next, but rather to open up greater flexibility to allow for, again, private landowners to do what they do best and read the market but do so in a way that controls for those basic parameters so that we know that whatever the private development does do, it reinforces the broader vision.
So that the entire area is form-based?
It is partially form-based. I think, you know, it's rare to get, so the question is about form-based zoning, which is a technical term for zoning that is more concerned about how a building looks than what's inside it. And there's really rarely zoning that lives at either end of the spectrum, right? You don't ever say you can build a box this big, but we don't care what you put in it. Or we only care what you do and we don't care how big the box is. Everything is kind of somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. I would say yes, this does push more towards the form end of the spectrum than your current zoning does.
I will also point out that that intersection of Lake and Route 20, the corners are zoned, 2 of them are zoned industrial and 2 of them are zoned commercial, so they're on opposing things. It's a very curious quirk in the history of the way that this all formed up. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to make that intersection a place so that it's like similar to what could happen on it. And again, the idea of trying to push development to the corners.
It seems to me, I don't know how familiar you are with Miller, but a lot of our vision is economic development of Lake Street and commercialization of the beach. I did not hear in your presentation anything about tourism or the lake or how we can capitalize on that through our train station. And that concerns me right now.
Sure. So again, you know, just to kind of take a step back, this is, the question was, we're concerned with tourism and economic development along the lakefront and down Lake Street, and how is that reflected in here? Is that?
Yes, I'm seeing like mixed residential use housing by the train station, which to me makes no sense, because we're really looking at that as a way to bring people in from Chicago,
Sure.
to get them to the beach easily. And then again with the form uses, here at Beach Town, you really don't want to lock people into a box about how their windows need to look, or they can only have a grand opening ceremony for 2 weeks.
Sure.
You know, there's a lot of that doesn't work at the beach town.
Sure, and I think that's a fair criticism if that were extended into the neighborhood more. Really, the larger, the higher density, the mixed use, the housing, and the larger commercial, all that's concentrated along 12 and 20. And this is using that as an anchor to allow for better access primarily to the lake and making a more welcoming entrance to our city, making sure that people can take the train and feel comfortable when they get off it and have a clear plan on how they're going to get to the end of the street. The zoning that reinforces Lake Street is indeed there to make sure that we maintain the commercial character here and allow for more businesses with clearer ideas of what their rules are when they decide to open up business. Most of this, which we didn't go into, is like as of right zoning. So if you follow these very basic parameters, you can just set up. You don't have to go to the BZA, you don't have to go to the city council every time you want to open a business. So it does speak to that. But certainly along the train station, the big focus was making sure that everyone had access to the train station, making sure that it was evenly distributed and fair for people in Glen Ryan and Etna to get the amenities, and they're not all in this side of Miller. And that was really the aim of this.
You have hundreds of women getting off the South Shore train at night, and you do not barricade Route 12 right now. It's a safety issue. It would provide 500 additional parking spaces. Why isn't it done now?
I can't speak to that. That's a state road. That's a large infrastructure project. Why isn't it done right now? I can't speak to that.
Temporary barricades. Because if the developers see, gee, we got another 500 cars here, that's going to help Lake Street and convince developers that come here. And it's a safety issue for the women getting off at night with kids. There's no security for that lot. Why not call the state and say, hey, put some barricades up? Why would they refuse?
Sure, yes, I suppose it is.
But why would they refuse? Why can't we do it tomorrow?
I can't.
Just call streets and sanitation. You got the council person here. Hey, put some barricades up. If the state doesn't like it, have them call me.
Guerrilla urbanism.
Okay, just a couple more questions.
When a lady gets hurt and you got predators in that lot, is it going to be on your hands because we didn't put it up? A temporary barricade?
Well, we certainly are addressing the issue in what we're trying to do. It's just it's a matter of time.
Email you to send your state rep.
Okay, a couple more questions, Jennifer?
Yeah, I have a, I'm curious when you talk about, I know you're not regulating fonts, I know you're not regulating font size and that sort of thing, but especially along Lake Street as a business owner, I fear a generic look.
Sure.
It's not what Miller is.
Yeah.
This is a very eclectic
Absolutely.
beachfront community, and I
Yeah.
fear that it'll turn out like some of the other.
Yeah, no, it
communities.
is not, I don't think it's overly prescriptive at all in terms of materials. It's really about limiting the few things that we think would detract
Okay.
from the character
It's not like
than
you're
it is about.
enforcing color choices.
Absolutely.
No,
No, absolutely.
No colors, no fonts.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, that's it.
I just wanted to add that, okay, you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, that this process, what it will yield is something very useful for the administrators within the city. A form or process where developers coming into the city will be given their criteria in a very realistic and simple form that will quickly allow them to know whether what they're doing fits our current zoning code or the revised code, or it doesn't. And so this whole process is to spur economic development, that as David said, to keep it, make sure that we are protecting our core goals and values for the Lakefront District. And we definitely are not going to in any way try to inhibit or change the unique character of Miller.
I think that's it. Oh, you have, George Rogie, did you have a question?
I know this is zoning, and, but at some point, and that point that'll be pretty darn quick, is that we have to get into how we move people around when 12 is not going to be going through. How do we get down Main Street?
An arch.
Oh, yeah.
And everything else.
One of the arts.
Right now,
Real
double
gateway.
tracking is really on track, right? And that means that things are gonna happen, they're gonna happen fast. And the Michael plan here, you know, cuts it off somewhere between, we cut it off and it turns.
Redirects
south
it.
On the east side to 20, somewhere around the Pancake House and McDonald's. That puts everybody on 20. So, you know, now we gotta get down Lake Street here.
Art
because-
arch.
Big arch. So we want to do some kind of an arch. Or redesign Atchison Road, so you wouldn't have to worry about the river. You can come right into the village. So both of those have to be designed soon. You know, because this is going to happen. That's all I want to say. I just want to try to have a meeting again on transportation and getting to place. I mean, after all, you know, when you look at that map, we didn't talk about where the bike path was. It's north of us 20. We didn't talk about where the lake was, where people are going. No, we didn't talk about the national park, all that's going on there. We didn't talk about the most important thing to the national park in on Lake Street is sidewalks. They have said over and over again, you put sidewalks from the train station to the lake, and we'll do anything you want.
They did talk about walkability, and that is a prime function of this.
And I think that's also a good segue to queue up that I know the South Shore Railroad wants to have a meeting in this district, and I don't know if they've reached out to you.
They have, we've met in Glen Ryan, and we're going to meet in Etna next. But that for the double tracking. And so those questions that George poses will be really good for that. So we are right at 7 o'clock. Oh my gosh, now
I just
we're.
want to say what the next steps are in case people want to have another opportunity to share any of the more detailed.
Okay, and, so let me have Mr. Common, and then we'll have next steps, because that
Sure.
was your portion on the
It
agenda.
was.
Okay.
The thing is, Ruby, please, whenever you make that section connect, do not
do a roundabout.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. All right, so Joe's going to do the next steps, and he's got about 30 seconds.
I'll do the,
If you want to hear the next steps, you'll have to pipe down. And Joe is going to share that. It was on the agenda, so I'm not letting him out of it.
Okay, appreciate it. This is sort of the final unveil of it. For those who want to get involved, we'll be turning this into ordinance form. It'll go presumably to the Plan Commission next. That's the next body that this would have to go through. March 28th is what we're shooting for, if we can get our act together. After which it would have to go to the City Council, so there's another opportunity to give input. Of course, you can always call the Redevelopment and Planning Office at 219-886-1531 and ask for myself, Joe. You can ask for Jack, and you can ask for Dorica, who's unfortunately sick today, who's been helping us as well. Happy, as always, to speak, but that's sort of the next plan. This is essentially a guinea pig. This is the first time we've done significant zoning changes in the neighborhood for quite some time. And this is really the springboard for doing this across the city. A lot of good planning work has already been done. The 2008 comprehensive plan, Gary Greenlink, Livable Broadway plans coming online with GPTC. So we're really trying to get the momentum, catch it, and do this iteratively. Time after time, go back to the neighborhoods, not just in Miller and University Park, but all over the city. So I'll be back here for sure, and I'll be in other places in the city, and we're going to, over the next 2 years, really try to put the city plan in action and make it so we can do the things we need to do, update our antiquated zoning, and really think about possibilities. So I'll be around, and I'll leave it with that. And thank you very much, Council.
Thank you.